Thank you very much for this kind introduction. After the first problem, security of supply is always an important thing. I'm extremely grateful for the invitation to this presentation here, not at least because there is a special relationship between Germany and Japan and me. And this is one of the important issues which played an important role for me. Germany and Japan are both high-tech countries with a strong focus on innovation. There has been a terrible event in 2011, the Fukushima disaster, which accelerated the energy transition or the efforts to energy transition in my country. An energy transition is called in Germany Energiewende, which is not really energy transition, it's more a U-turn, it's much more fundamental. And this term of Energiewende has been brought to the German debate in 1980 by a book of my institute, which was called Energiewende, Ways to Prosperity and Growth Without Uranium and Mineral Oil. And I'm with this institution for the last 25 years, working on theoretical analysis on energy transition and political and practical implementation up to the legislation for many, many fields. And then the missing link is between Japan and me. I was in March 2011, on the 11th of March, I was in Tokyo in the Ministry of Environment speaking about emissions trading, and I finished my presentation at 2:40. And 6 minutes later there was the earthquake, which has nothing to do with my presentation, but has fundamentally changed the situation in my country, that a concept which was tabled for the first time in 1980, brought to the mainstream of energy policy in my country. And we are working on this energy transformation or energy transition not only in Germany, we do this in the European Union. It's a learning process, it's a long process, it's a step-by-step process. And what I would like to report from this process in my presentation today are some lessons learned and some perspectives from these two energy policy laboratories of Germany and the European Union. And I think it's important to reflect what energy transition or energy transformation is about. And from my more academic definition, energy transformation is a policy-driven structural change of the energy system. And these are two important issues. It is policy-driven and it's structural change. And what I would like to highlight in my presentation are some of the issues which are important if it comes to the policy-driven process. And I would like to highlight a couple of issues, not all issues, what structural change in this fundamental transformation really means, and what the real challenges are, what the real drivers are, and what the real experiences are by now. If it is about the policy-driven structural change, and then the question is, what is the policy about? And policy, and that is probably also the issue of your graduate school, is about managing risks. And we had an interesting, very fundamental, very important paper for policy in my country by the Advisory Council of Global Affairs, which drafted a scheme of characteristics and structures of risk management. And there are always two dimensions of risk. There's first the extent of the damage and the probability of occurrence. And you need to reflect both dimensions to get an impression on what the nature of the risk is, what the characteristics of the risk are. And there are a couple of issues which are important if it comes to global issues. If it comes to global issues, then usually it is about risks where the extent of damage is extremely high. And we have one, and this is probably the biggest challenge the mankind has at the moment, that we have a problem where the extent of damage is extremely high and the probability of occurrence is also high, and this is climate change. Climate change is probably one of the biggest challenges for humankind and also for energy policy and the design of the energy system. But there are, however, other systems, and the Advisory Council has named these risk structures referring to the Greek mythology. This is the Cassandra risk. Cassandra, this has been the blind woman which made projections and prognosis nobody believed, but she was always right. And so it is important, and we know this. There's another typical risk where the extent of damage is high, but the probability of occurrence is comparatively low. This is a typical characteristic of nuclear disasters or disasters linked to dams, and the Advisory Council named this the Damocles. This is the problem which always can be there, and where you can multiply big numbers with small numbers and come to acceptable results. But if the small numbers materialize, then the question is, and this is a political, it's an ethical question, if you are ready to accept this damage of this level of damages. To illustrate this from modeling from my country, a nuclear disaster, a large nuclear disaster in my country would cost about 14 trillion US dollars, which is a sixfold of the annual gross domestic product. But we have also other risks. There are broader or more dangerous consequences of climate change. They are self-enforcing repercussions of the climate system. But it is important to reflect this type of risks. And if you then go through the energy system and ask the question, what is your view, what is your stand on sustainability? Then obviously there is no future for fossil fuels in the energy system if the limits of the atmospheres are going to disappear in terms of climate change and the ability to deal with this huge issue. And we had a long debate in the 1970s and 80s on the resource availability. But if you look on the resource availability from the perspective of climate change, then you see very, very quickly that probably the resource availability is not the major issue. Because if we would like to limit the global warming to levels which avoid dangerous climate change, then we are probably only able to use 1/3 of the reserves we have underground. These are the reserves. That means the energy resources which we know about, which we can mine with today's technologies and at today's costs. And that means the much stronger limit in terms of sustainability for the use of fossil fuels come obviously from global warming and the need to manage climate change. We have a carbon-free source, nuclear fuels. There has been a huge debate on what's the resource availability with cycles or with storage of this, but again, the resources are probably not the strongest limit. The strongest limit is that there's a possibility of extremely high levels of damage in case of nuclear disasters as a Damocles type of risk. And if it comes to the sustainability in terms of very long-term waste disposal, then there is essentially no solution there, and or no experiences which could allow a very serious assessment what could be sustainable in these ways. And we have renewable energies, which obviously are sustainable if it comes to the global warming and the emission of greenhouse gases. But on the other hand, there are corridors. There are corridors for renewables which are also important if it comes to sustainability, and that is especially true in terms of biomass. The sustainable resources of biomass are limited. If you look on this from the global perspective, and this needs to be reflected in strategies to protect the climate, etc., etc. And we have comparable risk if it comes to large hydropower, etc., etc. So, and the challenge is to combine these different limitations, to combine these corridors in terms of fossil fuels and greenhouse gas emissions to strategies which make the energy system a more sustainable one. And this is not an issue of today or tomorrow. These are the carbon dioxide emissions from my country to show that it is a long history. It's a long history of emissions, or in other words, that my country has made use for long term of the resource of the atmosphere. We have data since 1820 on emissions, and you can see here world history, the industrialization, the takeoff of coal, then the World War I, the Great Depression, the World War II, then the post-war recovery, the German unification, which brought down some of the emissions, and then you can see here the corridor, what the recent targets in terms of future greenhouse gas emissions for this country are. And I would like to leave you two messages with this graph. The first is, it's about responsibility. It's about a long history. The climate problem results not from emissions, it results from concentrations of radioactive gases in the atmosphere, and concentration is nothing else like than the cumulative emissions. And if you have a long history of emissions like my country, you need to be at the forefront on all the efforts to solve the problems. If one wants to deal with all these challenges, essentially, and we call these the 4A questions, you need to answer 4 questions which all have to do with A. The first is, are the emission reduction potentials available? Are the technologies there? Will the technologies there, etc., etc.? And what we have seen during the last essentially 3 decades, that the technology is there. When I started at Öko Institute in 1990, the scientific mainstream in the economic literature in my country was that the technical potential of renewables to supply the German electricity system would be between 2 and 3 percentage points of consumption. We have added last year 3 percentage points to the electricity supply from renewables. And so we have seen a huge technological progress. I will go into a bit more detail in the second part of my presentation. And so probably the technologies are not the limitation. The second issue, it's a more important. Is it possible to exploit these potentials over time in a way that the targets are achievable? We have a lot of debate on the year 2050. I will be in pension year in 2050. It seems to be long away. But in terms of the energy system, 2050 is tomorrow. It's 1 generation of a power plant. It's 1/3 of a lifetime of a German building, and it's 1 renovation cycle of the German buildings. So the 3 generations of cars away, and so it is tomorrow. And the key issue is, and that is an important point if it comes to the economics, how can one deal with the lifetime of the capital stocks? And this is the key challenge if the gradient of emission reduction should be very steep, as I have shown to you in my last slide. It is about managing durable capital stocks. And so timing is one of the key issues. And so you can't snip with your fingers and tomorrow the technology is there. We need transitions and we need steady processes of substitution. Infrastructures are key. I will also come back to this later. And innovation is key because we need a combination, we need coordination, and innovation is a key determinant of the process in many dimensions. The third is all these affordable? Because at least in democratic systems, affordability is an important issue. And what we see is that, and I also will show you some modeling exercises from the European Union, it is without any doubt affordable. The key challenge in terms of cost is the cost distribution. Policy is always driven by distributional conflicts, and the key challenge will be to manage the distributional contracts. It's not about the system cost, it's about distribution. And the fourth issue is the whole system acceptable to the public? And one of the challenges, and I also will come back to this in the later part of my presentation, what energy transition means is essentially that the interfaces between the energy system and the society increase dramatically. And the problem is, or the challenge is, to manage these interfaces between the society and the energy system, which will increase significantly in a way that you can maintain public acceptance. This is the result of the policy programmatics in Germany. We have essentially two pillars. The first is to decarbonize the electricity or decarbonize the energy system by mid of the centuries by reducing all greenhouse gas emissions by 80 to 95% by the mid of the century. And if you look to all the sectors where the emission abatement potentials are limited, if you look to agriculture, methane emissions, etc., then this is essentially the decarbonization of the energy system. And the second pillar is that nuclear power should be phased out. By the year 2022, we have already decommissioned about 50% of the capacity which was there in 2010, and the last German nuclear power plant will be decommissioned in 2022. Just yesterday there was published a new poll on German public attitudes in the framework of all the refugee crisis and the management of Chancellor Merkel. And one of the interesting byproducts of this opinion poll was that 75% of the German voters agree with this accelerated phase-out profile, and there will probably no reversion of this. And if you want to go for decarbonization, if you want to phase out nuclear, then you have to do a lot in terms of energy and renewables, energy efficiency and renewables. And these are the targets for the different sectors, for primary energy, for housing, for the electricity sector, etc., etc. I will focus in my presentation a bit on the electricity sector because this is the most important sector for our system in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. It's about 50% of the CO2 emissions or 40% of the total greenhouse gas emissions. And this is the key sector if it comes to decarbonization. The German government will decide next year on a long-term strategy and a medium-term policy package to go for these emission reduction targets, and we are just working on the modeling, on the background modeling for this decision. We will have proposals in January or February next year, and we will have political decisions by the end of next year on the long-term, more specific targets, and the medium-term policy package. Medium-term means 2030. This is the new target horizon for the European Union and Germany. And we are just running the modeling exercises for the background to calculate the cost, to calculate all the structural things, etc., etc. And I would like to show you very quickly 4 slides which should underline the need for activities in the different sectors. The first is, these are the total greenhouse gas emissions. We are close to 30% below, below 1990 levels. That has partly to do with the German unification, with all the shutdown of the inefficient East German industry, but we have seen some further reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, but this gradient, which we have seen up to now, needs to be accelerated to be consistent with the long-term targets. And you can see here the power sector again, and this is the sector which needs to deliver the largest part of the greenhouse gas emission abatement. And all sectors need to contribute, even the agriculture. But if the Germans continue to eat some schnitzel sometimes, then there will be emissions from the kettles, and that means there is no way for 100% greenhouse gas emission reduction for sectors like agriculture. But the consequence is that for all the energy sector, especially the power sector, early decarbonization is needed. If you translate this into primary energy, then you can see an interesting structural change. Number one, we need to be much more efficient in the system. There are some statistical artifacts in this due to the statistical conventions on how renewables is treated, but essentially you can see here is if nuclear disappears from the system, it is essentially the decrease of coal consumption. And so we have in the European Union this very heated debate on the coal phase out. You have probably heard the announcement of the UK. We have comparable debates in Germany, in the Netherlands, etc., etc. And you can see here in the power sector, it's about phasing out coal and substituting coal by other sources. You can see here the red bar. This is petroleum product. This is essentially transportation. We use petroleum products essentially in the transportation. You can see here the longest lasting fossil fuel is natural gas. But in the end of the day, if it is about decarbonization, then the consumption of natural gas needs to be reduced significantly after 2030, and you can see here the significant increase of renewables in this future system, which will trigger a fundamentally different structure of the system. This is the final energy consumption. Again, it's phasing out in the final energy consumption. Coal does not play a significant role. There's a small part of coal for the iron and steel production, but it is essentially to increase energy efficiency of buildings, to save energy for heating. It's to make the transport more energy efficient and switch to carbon-free sources, and to bring in renewables. And this is for the sectors. You can see here the residential sector. My country is it's a cold country. We spend a lot of energy for heating, and so it is about this long-term reduction of energy consumption for space heating. But you can see here that there are obviously limits. If the renovation rate of buildings is 30 years for full turnover of the capital stock, and you can see essentially all sectors need to contribute. The interesting point is, what does that mean for the electricity sector? And there we see essentially 3 different mechanisms. The first is, for the next years, we will see a decrease of electricity consumption due to increased energy efficiency in appliances. We will see the phase out of fossil fuels and the phase in of renewables. But after 2030, at least according to our modeling, we will see the reverse trend in terms of electricity consumption because of electrification of transport, because electricity is one of the sources which will play a major role for decarbonization in the end-use sectors, in the heating sectors, etc., etc. And so we need to manage a decline of production, but then an increase of production, which then needs to be based on renewables. And you can see here that wind energy will be the major source of renewable electricity in Germany from 2030 onwards, which has significant consequences for the system and for infrastructure, but I will show you some more details on this. This is not political fantasy. This is a strict political program, and in the end of the day, it's already legislation. This is the European Union emissions trading scheme, which covers about 40% of the emissions in Europe, of the 28 member states and 3 associated members. And this is the cap which is in the system. We will decide next year on a mechanism what we call the linear reduction factor, and the linear reduction factor will be accelerated to 2.2% from 2021 onwards, and that means that if you, and this is legislation, this is not a program, this is legislation, it's in the law that this linear reduction, that the cap contraction is at the moment 1.74% annually, and from 2021 it will be 2.2% annually. And if this is in the law, then it's a simple geometry. That means decarbonization in the year 2058. So you can see, this is the reality each investor in the European Union needs to deal with. Because this is an instrument which is there. This cap contraction is in the legislation, or is already in the legislation here, will be in the legislation here from the next year. And so this is really serious stuff, because it is legal. It's legally binding for the European Union, at least for those sectors which are regulated by the European Union emissions trading scheme. We don't have these long-term commitments for the other sectors, but this is the essential. This is essentially the heavy industry and the power sector. However, what does that mean for structures and cost? I spent the year 2011 in the advisory council to the Energy Commissioner of the European Union on the so-called EU Energy Roadmap 2050. That was a project where the European Union reflected different pathways for the future, including decarbonization, and reflecting the different attitudes to different technologies in Europe. You know, there are countries like Denmark and Germany, there are countries like France or the Czech Republic, heavily committed to nuclear. There are other countries like the UK, committed to nuclear and renewables, etc., etc. They are very different stats. And the interesting result from this analysis was that it has been probably the most comprehensive comparative analysis of different trajectories for the future of the European energy system. And there will be some graphs which all follow the same structure. What we did in this exercise, and there are hundreds of pages of reports and statistics on this, we have obviously the status quo. We have analyzed 2 different scenarios, or 2 different trajectories for an energy system which is not based on decarbonization. It's a bit business as usual, it's policy as usual. So that means the existing policies will be continued but not accelerated. And then we have analyzed 5 different scenarios or 5 different pathways towards decarbonization in Europe. One is with a strong focus on energy efficiency, one with a strong focus on renewables, one with a strong focus on nuclear, one with a strong focus on carbon capture and sequestration, and some mix. And it's interesting to have a look what the results are from this analysis. Number one, this is the existing primary energy structure of Europe. This is the Europe of the 27 member states before Croatia joined the European Union. You can see here there's some coal, there's a lot of gas, and there's a lot of mineral oil and petroleum in the system. That will slightly decrease. We will see, even in the business as usual, a significant increase of renewables, but this will, however, be less than 20% of the primary energy supply. And then you can go through the different decarbonization scenarios, and there you have different mixes of the primary energy supply to meet the decarbonization targets. What does that mean for the power sector? And the interesting point is, whatever the stand on nuclear or carbon capture and sequestration is, that there will, at least in 2030, will be at least 50% of the power generation will come from renewables. And then there is a fight for 20%, which is between the fossil fuels, the nuclear, and the CCS. And so the characteristics which are somehow linked with renewables, and this is essentially wind and solar because of economic reasons in Europe, these effects will structurally change the whole system. Whatever your stand is, if you have 20% nuclear in the portfolio, or if you will phase out nuclear. And the most interesting point on this comparative analysis is, what does that mean for the cost? What is shown here, again, the status quo, the business as usual, the different decarbonization scenarios. And these are the system costs. That means it's the total of all the costs of the system. And there's a lot of interesting detail in it, but I would like to leave you this graph with 4 messages. The first is, and that's a difficult news for policymakers, whatever we do, the future system will be more expensive. Even in a world where you don't follow the decarbonization trajectory, you need to reinvest the system. And in a world where steel is more expensive and conventional power plants are today the double of the cost we have seen at the turn of the century, nuclear between the 3- and 4-fold what we have seen at the turn of the century, the total system will be between 25 and 30% more expensive. Whatever we do, and this is the counterfactual. It's important to bear in mind, this is the yardstick for affordability. It's not the past, it's not the status quo, it's the reinvesting the system. And during the next 30 to 40 years, we need to reinvest the system. The second is that the costs, with one exception, are very comparable. Even if we don't go for decarbonization, if we go for decarbonization, the costs, and I will give you the background of this, will be comparable. There's only one exception, but I will come back to this later. The third is, it will be an extremely capital-intensive system. And this has enormous consequences, that a large part of the system will be based on technology which essentially have no short-term marginal costs, where the majority of the cost will be capital. And that has significant consequences for the system, and you all know this because you all have these pretty nice fancy gadgets. The short-term marginal cost of a telephone minute is 0, and therefore a system which is based on selling telephone minutes can't pay back for the investment. What is the solution here? Flat rates. And the flat rate is nothing else. What we will see in the electricity system, it's a capacity payment. We will shift the system towards revenue streams which are essentially based on capacity payments and not longer on payments on energy. And then the fourth message is, but I will come back to this with some specifics, some slides later. There is one exemption on the cost. This is the fully renewable system. This is the German way. There is a cost difference after 2030, which has to do with storage. Because storage is expensive and storage needs to be managed. Again, we did this in the year 2011. We assumed costs for nuclear, which have been 1/3 of the cost the British colleagues are paying for Hinkley Point C. 1/3, so we underestimated the cost by 2/3. We have assumed for 2030 cost of PV, which we have seen 2 years ago. That means we have been extremely pessimistic on renewables. We have assumed storage costs, which we are pretty much beyond the schedule, and we have been probably realistic if it comes to carbon capture and sequestration. But there, the barriers are probably not the economic barriers. It is public acceptance and permanence of the reservoirs, etc., etc. And that means if you bear in mind this picture, then it is not that much about the cost. It's about the cost distribution. Capacity payments are, in social terms, regressive. One needs to address this. And we need to reorganize the whole market arrangements. But this is a part of a longer transition process. And I think one of the experience, and again, I have some sympathy for long-term time series of data. This is the power generation in Germany. You can see that it has never been an unchanged system. We had a more or less robust system for less than 2 decades. The first phase, rapid growth, the phase-in of nuclear, the phase-in of lignite, stagnation, the increase of renewables to, we will see this year, probably more than 30% of total power generation, and these are the future plans. And this looks, okay, it's nice, it's a bit steeper than the increase, but what I would like to present to you in the next slide is that this is a fundamental structural change. This is the situation, and all the next slides will be based on this situation. Here we started at almost 5%. It's mostly hydro in the early 1990s. We are here at the 30%. These are the corridors which are at the moment in our legislation for the support mechanism of renewables. And you can see here that this increase will in future be based essentially in solar and wind. And that has not only implications for the market shares, this has structural implications which go beyond. This is the good old world. We ran the system for 100 years. This is a dark and cold week in Germany, week number 50, December. This is the good old world. Base load, nuclear and lignite, medium load, hard coal and some gas, peak load, oil. And I will rush to this graph, how this dark and cold week in Germany will change over the next years. These are historical data. Blue is the wind, yellow is solar. In 2013, these are historical data. 2023, 2033. You can see that even in a dark and cold week, which is not really windy in Germany, you will see that the opportunity for baseload has disappeared. And even in such a week, wind will deliver in 2033, at least in some hours of the dark and cold week in Germany, the whole system. That means, and I will show you this for other weeks, the system will change from an horizontally structured system, base load, medium load, peak load, to a system which is vertically organized. Much wind, much solar, less solar, much import, less import, etc., etc. demand. Now we go to a windy week. the good old week, that's also November, December. Base load, medium load, peak load. 2013, you can see here, the medium load has mostly disappeared. 2023, it's even more disappearing. 2033, and that is pretty well before 2030. You can see here that 1/3 of the week is fully supplied by wind. Now we go to a sunny week. Base load, medium load, peak load. Week number 29, it's in summer, consumption is lower. And you can see here, it is essentially a solar game. And the interesting point is that the peak demand, which represented peak prices, disappears. 2033, you will see the reverse structure. The peak at noon, and now we have the record low of the residual load at noon and the sunny week. Okay, we go to a windy and sunny week where you have combined same structure, and you can see here that in 2033 we need to start to work with storage because the generation is much below. It's much below the load demand, and that means the traditionally horizontal structure is structurally changed into a vertical structure, which is much more coordination intensive because we are trading at the moment electricity for each quarter of an hour. Each quarter of an hour, you need to have other dispatch decisions and you need much more coordination. And this is even more true if you have a look on the new structure of generation. We run, again, the German system traditionally by between 300 and 500 generation units. In last summer, we had in Germany approximately 1.3, 1.4 million power generation units. 1.4 million, not 400, not 300, 1.4. And this is at 30%. And if we are going for the 50, 60, 70, 80% power generation from renewables, this will be represented by 10 to 15 million power generation units, which need to be invested. That's a less important problem, which needs to be coordinated. We need totally different market arrangements to deal with this. And furthermore, this has structurally changed the ownership. This is the total capacity of renewables we had in 2012. We have, we have in my country, we have 4 large utilities and approximately 900 municipal utilities. And these 4 major utilities represent 80% of the traditional power generation capacity, and the remaining 20% is owned by the other utilities. What we have seen in the renewable sector, that 85% of the ownership is by non-traditional enterprise or entities. That means the traditional energy industry owns 15% of the capacity, and 85% is owned by other entities, which is also one of the reasoning why this is a pretty robust trend. And I would like to highlight this group, the farmers. The farmers, at least in my country, will never vote for Greens. They will never vote for Social Democrats. They will always vote for the Conservatives. And this is one of their key constituencies. And because this new energy world has settled so significantly in this constituency, this is practically impossible, even for the Conservatives, to reverse this trend, because there are new winners in the system. The bad news is there are also new vested interests, which is not always a good news. But this is the structural change. Who owns the system? The second structural dimension is about geography. This is Germany here, and we have traditional characteristics of the system. No load and a bit of nuclear, a bit of coal in the north. High load in the west, strongly based on coal. In the east, after deindustrialization, after unification, no load essentially, but a lot of coal. And we have a lot of load in the southern part, which is the industrialized, the strong industrialized part, where the system is mainly based on nuclear. And this system will be changed geographically. And that's the new world. There will be, again, no load in the north. But 50% of the power generation of Germany will come from this region. Because it's windy, the population density is low, there's a lot of land, etc., etc. In the high load region of the west, the coal will disappear, and we will have high load, we will have continuingly high load, but a medium range of renewables. We have in the eastern part, again, the coal phase out, no load, but a lot of wind. This is the part which holds the world records of integration of renewables. The transmission system operator of the eastern part of Germany integrates at the moment 50% of electricity from wind. This is the share these guys are managing on a day-to-day basis. It's not theory. They are managing 50% wind in the system because they have extremely low load and strong wind potentials, and you have the situation in the south, again, a lot of load, a lot of PV, but it will probably not sufficient to deliver the whole load. And the answer is to build infrastructure. And that means that one of the structural implications is that we probably, or we will definitely need a new system of infrastructure, which needs to be rolled out. They need to be rolled out. It is linked to 15 years lead time, at least in my country, all the licensing processes, etc., etc. And we are just planning these sea lines from the north to the south to reflect the new geography of power generation in the country. This is probably the most challenging part of the system change. It's not about costs. It's about public acceptance of building huge DC lines from the north to the south. This is the new level of interfaces between society and the energy system. The traditional interfaces have been at the hotspots, but now we will have an equally distributed number of interfaces between the people and the energy system. What does that mean in structural terms? We all know the future is uncertain, and we don't know what the future really could look like. This is the bad news. And we don't know what is the future of storage in the future. But we are able, and that's the important point, we are able in a very robust way to characterize the future electricity system. It will be significantly more energy efficient, but not necessarily less consuming. It needs to be CO2 free on the long term and low CO2 intensive in the medium term. It will be much more diverse in terms of technologies, in terms of centralized, decentralized, and distributed. The economic perspectives. In the good old world, the economic perspective was the perfect macroeconomic optimization. Everybody competed on the electricity exchange at a central trading place. Now we will see 30% of the generators which are not competing at the electricity exchange. They will compete for grid parity. If these guys are opting out from the system and do not disconnect themselves from the system, this is a distributional problem. Because the costs for the infrastructure do not disappear. Others pay the bill. But these are different economic appraisals. And one needs to deal with this. So it's an important point of structural change. It will be much more decentralized, not completely. Even if we would see 300 gigawatts of PV, that would mean that we need another 300 to 400 from wind and offshore wind. But there will be, as a new element, a significant part which is heavily or strongly decentralized. It will be much more coordination intensive. How to coordinate operations of 10 million generators. I have no idea how to do this without markets, without basing this on price signals, and making network operators neutral, which is one of the free riding effects of energy, of the energy transition, that because of the liberalization, the big generators had to sell off their networks, and the networks overnight became supportive to renewables. Before, they fought heavily against the renewables because of their generation systems. After they were neutralized, their only business model is investment in infrastructure, and the renewables is the only business case they have for the future. And so the transmission system operators are in between the strongest supporters of the transition towards renewables, because that's their business case. It is, again, there's also a bad news, new vested interest, overinvestment in the infrastructure. It will be much more capital intensive, much more infrastructure intensive, much more sensitive to public acceptance. You need other ways of participation, and especially, and this is probably one of the parallels between our countries. My country has never been a country of participation. Germany is a command and control country. We got elections, we got a government, and the governments do the job. This is not longer sufficient. And so we have developed a strategy of participation with green papers, white papers, etc., because public acceptance is the new currency. And this requires a total different style of policymaker. It is probably not significantly more expensive. We have a comparatively high surcharge for renewables, but 40% of this surcharge is because the German ratepayer has paid down the global cost of PV. During the steep part of the learning curve of the cost reductions in the PV, the German market has represented between 40 and 75% of the global market, and so the German ratepayers, which are the rich ratepayers, have paid a significant share of the learning curve of this technology. Again, it's about transition, and if one asked policymakers, and that's my last slide, what are the key pillars? What are the things each policymakers, or what we try to write down for policymakers to make them check each evening, what did I for in the box A, in the box B, in the box C, and the box D. And these are the 4 boxes. The first is you need to bring in the new options. It's renewables, it's flexibilities, it's backup, etc. This is not only about support schemes of financing. It's also about neutralization of networks. It is about the non-technical infrastructure that you have financing for this type of projects as a product of the financial industry, and not as a certain and very rare example. We need to have a sustainable economic basis. This is another word for market design. We need another market design. However, what we have seen, especially in my country, this is not enough. We have been very successful in rolling out renewables. Very good news. The bad news is the greenhouse gas emissions decreased much slower, because the renewables have killed in the traditional system the cleanest sources first. Natural gas is expensive. Natural gas has disappeared from the German electricity system because the renewables have substituted the natural gas. The original idea to substitute the lignite and the hard coal, and not the natural gas. That means you need to have active policies to design the exit gates. We have this emissions trading scheme, which is a nice instrument, but which is in a deep crisis at the moment. The UK has introduced a price floor. We have seen some efforts to do the same. Now we will pay a decommissioning premium for all lignite-fired power plants. But designing the exit game is a complementary policy, because otherwise it won't work. If you want to be cynical, then the traditional German way has been climate or energy policy Thatcherism. Pushing in something and hoping on the trickling down effect. Never works. You need to manage the supply side and the demand side. And that's why emissions trading and all these managing instruments for the old part of the system is important. Infrastructure is the third box. Infrastructure needs lead time, at least in our regulatory framework, and we need at least to make decisions on infrastructure which are suitable to the energy system in 2025. That's 10 years ahead. But these decisions have to be made now. And you need to have some planning processes and planning certainty. And you need to reflect the new geography, and you need to reflect the technical dimension of the infrastructure and the non-technical dimension. And there's the innovation side. And as I have shown before, storage is an important problem for the energy transition in the power sector. But it needs to be materialized in 2030 and onwards. And so it's not the problem of today, it's not the problem of tomorrow. But we need to put innovation processes on track which somehow guarantee that we have suitable solutions on storage, for example, on other flexibility options, if this is necessary, and this is 2030. And that means a forward-looking technology and innovation policy is the necessary fourth box of this policy mix. And one of the experiences from the German laboratory and the EU laboratory, as soon as you ignore one of these tracks, then you won't, or you will rush into very significant challenges in terms of managing the structural change. And again, if energy transition is the result of policy-driven structural change, then you need to manage the structural change and not only to initiate a process toward which policy tends to go for. And these are the four indispensable pillars you need to structure this transformation. Because, and that's my last word, transformation is not substituting the black box by the green box. It's about structural change. And this needs to be reflected in political instruments, in how society behaves and how policy works and how markets are organized. Thank you very much.